there is belief, and then there is skepticism. And between those two lies a vast territory of questions and the unknown. But what if reality is far more complex than we've been willing to perceive? And what if the stories that we dismiss as myth and legend hold the keys to understanding consciousness? From ghostly encounters to mysterious lights in the sky, humanity has always sensed there was something more out there. Some call it the paranormal, and others call it the divine. Some search the stars for answers, while others look within. They are all connected, threads in the grand tapestry of life. But we stand at a place where the fabric between realities is much thinner than you might think, because this is Crossroads of the Veil. Just northeast of San Antonio lies the city of Converse. Today it's a bustling suburban area. If you drive through it now, you'll see paved highways, sprawling neighborhoods, and manicured green spaces. But underneath that contemporary suburban sprawl lies a profound and bloody pioneer history. Back in the 1800s, this land was a rugged, untamed scrubland. And hidden within that pioneer history is one of South Texas's most terrifying and tragic cryptid legends, the Converse Werewolf. To understand the nightmare that allegedly took place in these woods, we cannot simply look at the monster. We must first dissect the environment that birthed it. The landscape of South Texas, specifically the region encompassing Bexar County, represents a geographical and cultural crossroads. This landscape was not merely a passive backdrop for the legend. It was an active, hostile participant in the lives of the early settlers. Bexar County was officially created on December 20th, 1836, but its original borders were practically incomprehensible by modern standards. It originally encompassed almost the entire western portion of the Republic of Texas, stretching into disputed areas of western New Mexico and northward toward Wyoming. Long before European boots ever touched the dirt, the Yanaguana River Valley and the surrounding scrublands were populated for millennia by seasonally migrating, non-sedentary Native American tribes known collectively as the Coahuiltecans. Let's pause on that detail, as it is crucial for understanding the survival dynamics of the region. The Coahuiltecans were not a single unified nation, but rather hundreds of small, autonomous bands sharing similar languages and living off the harsh South Texas plains. Archaeological evidence, such as the discoveries at the Pavo Real site and the Richard Bean site, provides a window into the early, middle, and late Archaic periods. These findings demonstrate a long history of human occupation that was entirely dependent on the region's delicate hydrological balance. Water was life, and the rivers were the arteries of the frontier. The European footprint began to solidify when Spanish explorers, including Domingo Ramon and Fray Antonio San Buenaventura Olivares, recognized the strategic value of the San Pedro and San Antonio Springs. By 1718, Martin de Alarcon established the Presidio San Antonio. The purpose of this military outpost was to protect the Franciscan missions and contest the fierce resistance of the Lipan Apache. In 1731, the arrival of 55 Canary Islanders further established the civil government. Why is this history of settlement important to a werewolf legend? Because from its very inception, this region was defined by violent conflict. It was a persistent daily struggle between indigenous populations fighting for their homeland, colonial forces attempting to tame it, and the unforgiving, unpredictable natural environment itself. By the 1780s, Spanish officials had established a tenuous peace with the Comanche. However, these tribes continued to control much of the outlying territory, creating an atmosphere of perpetual frontier anxiety. You never knew what or who was waiting beyond the tree line. And nowhere was that anxiety more concentrated than a specific topographical juncture near Converse, a place ominously named Skull's Crossing. The geographic epicenter of our legend is a low-water crossing on Cibolo Creek. It is worth noting that the violent nomenclature of Skull's Crossing appears in multiple river systems in the region, including the San Marcos River near Martindale, reflecting the ubiquitous dangers of the Texas waterways. The area is characterized by rolling prairies that suddenly dip into thick, isolating forest canopies along the creek's embankments. Let's look at the geological reality of this natural theater of terror. Geological surveys of the Cibolo Creek Basin reveal a landscape dominated by blue clay, interlaced with large lenses of sand and imposing sandstone. This rugged, uneven terrain, combined with the dense vegetation including gum trees, cypress, magnolia, and oaks that stop short of the coastal plains, created an environment that was visually impenetrable and ecologically isolated. It was a natural theater perfectly suited for frontier anxieties, predatory ambushes, and unexplained wildlife encounters. This was the hostile, unforgiving stage set in the mid to late 1800s. It was into this dark, sulfur-scented forest that a tough, hardened rancher would send his quiet 15-year-old son to hunt. It was a crucible designed to test a boy's mettle, but the woods of Skull Crossing were not empty. There was something waiting. If you look up at the Texas sky on a clear summer day, it is a vast, brilliant blue. It looks peaceful, infinite. But for the pioneers of the 19th century, that endless blue sky could become an ocean of torment. To understand what was waiting in the shadowy depths of Skull's Crossing, we have to understand the invisible hand that pushed it there. We have to understand the year 1868. The legend of the Converse Werewolf is often told as a simple ghost story, a campfire tale of a boy, a monster, and a full moon. But monsters do not exist in a vacuum. They are bound by the same brutal laws of nature as any other living creature. And in the late 1860s, the laws of nature in South Texas were completely upended by an ecological catastrophe. To prove this, we don't look at old journals or newspaper clippings, which can be prone to human exaggeration. We look at the most unassailable historical record nature provides, the trees. Through the science of dendrochronology, climatologists can reconstruct historical weather patterns with astonishing accuracy. Dendrochronology is the study of tree rings. Every year, a tree adds a new layer of wood to its trunk. In years with plentiful rain, the ring is wide, reflecting robust growth. In years of severe drought, the ring is incredibly narrow, sometimes almost imperceptible. When scientists examine the ancient bald cypress trees along the river basins of Central and South Texas, specifically looking at the rings corresponding to the decade following the American Civil War, a terrifying picture emerges. The data reveals a massive multi-year rainfall deficit that peaked around 1868. This wasn't just a dry summer. To grasp the severity of this, you have to understand the fragile ecology of the Edwards Plateau, the rocky, elevated region just northwest of Bexar County, commonly known as the Texas Hill Country. This area acts as a massive limestone sponge. When it rains, the water filters down through the porous rock, feeding the underground aquifers that subsequently birth the rivers and creeks of the lowlands, including Cibolo Creek. But when the rains fail to come for consecutive years, that limestone sponge dries out entirely. The springs stop bubbling, the creeks recede into isolated, stagnant pools, and an invisible, deadly domino effect begins to ripple down the food chain. We call this an ecological cascade. First, the deep-rooted prairie grasses wither and die. Without the grass, the primary consumers, the white-tailed deer, the jackrabbits, the wild turkeys, begin to starve. The herbivore populations plummet, either dying off in mass numbers or migrating hundreds of miles in desperate search of greener pastures. And when the prey vanishes, the predators are left behind to starve. In the 1860s, the Texas Hill Country was teeming with apex predators. This was long before government-sponsored eradication programs wiped them out. The landscape was roamed by the Texas lobo wolf, an exceptionally large and aggressive subspecies of the gray wolf. There were massive mountain lions, also known as cougars or pumas, stalking the limestone bluffs, and there were black bears foraging in the dense cedar breaks. Normally, these apex predators maintained a strict, instinctual boundary between themselves and human settlements. Humans meant gunfire, traps, and fire. The predators stayed in the deep wilderness, thriving on the abundant deer population. But starvation is a powerful catalyst. It strips away fear. It overrides millions of years of evolutionary caution. As the drought of 1868 choked the life out of the hill country, the natural food web disintegrated. A starving wolf or desperate mountain lion will not simply lie down and die. It will adapt. It will move. Driven by the agonizing pangs of hunger, these shadow predators began to migrate southeast, following the dry creek beds out of the hills and down into the lowlands. They were following the only scent of water and meat left in the region, the pioneer homesteads of Bexar County. The human settlers, completely oblivious to the mass migration of starving predators heading their way, were fighting their own battle against the sky. Let's bring this macroecological disaster down to the micro level. Let's look at the Vance family, our central figures in the Converse legend. Elias Vance was a man hardened by an unforgiving world. He had poured his blood, sweat, and meager savings into a patch of scrubland near the Converse settlement. He had built his cabin by hand, tilled the stubborn, clay-heavy soil, and slowly built up a small herd of livestock. The drought was slowly, systematically destroying everything he had built. There was no irrigation network to save them, no government relief funds to bail them out. They were entirely dependent on the whims of the atmosphere. Day after day, Elias would look out over his dying crops, watching the soil turn to powder and blow away in the hot, relentless wind. His livestock, the family's only real wealth and source of protein, were growing gaunt. The cattle were chewing on the bitter, thorny scrub brush just to keep their stomachs full. The water level in their hand-dug well was dropping ominously low. The air was thick with the constant, irritating hum of cicadas and the pervasive smell of dust. It was an environment that bred immense stress, short tempers, and a deep, gnawing desperation. And then the attacks began. It didn't happen all at once. It started subtly. A missing chicken here. A half-eaten calf found torn apart near the edge of the property line there. At first, Elias likely blamed the usual suspects, a stray coyote or a desperate bobcat. But as the blistering summer of 1868 dragged on, the killings grew bolder, more frequent, and exponentially more violent. The predators descending from the hill country were not acting like normal wild animals. They were acting like an invading army. They were emaciated, hyper-aggressive, and hunting in sheer desperation. Reports from neighboring counties during this era detail horrifying accounts of livestock being slaughtered in broad daylight, right inside their pens. But there was something else happening in the woods around Converse, something that the pioneers couldn't quite identify. The tracks they were finding in the hardened mud near the shrinking waterholes of Cibolo Creek didn't look like wolf tracks. They were too large. They were too deeply impressed into the soil, suggesting an animal of immense, unnatural weight. And most disturbingly, some of the tracks seemed to indicate a creature that was walking on two legs. Could the severe drought have pushed something else out of the deep wilderness? Something ancient, something anomalous, that usually stayed hidden in the darkest, most inaccessible ravines of the Edwards Plateau. Cryptozoologists suggest that environmental extremes are often the catalyst for cryptid sightings. When an ecosystem collapses, the deep woods anomalies are forced into the light, competing for the same dwindling resources as everyone else. The geographical funnel of this crisis was Cibolo Creek. While most of the surface water in the region had evaporated, a few deep, shaded pools remained at Skull's Crossing, protected from the baking sun by the dense canopy of cypress and oak trees. This made Skull's Crossing a vital, highly contested oasis. It was an explosive convergence. You had Elias Vance, a desperate, angry father watching his livelihood be torn apart by unseen predators. You had his son Thomas, a quiet, sensitive boy, who was utterly unequipped to handle the brutal realities of this harsh frontier. You had a mass migration of starving, fearless apex predators pushed out of the hills, and potentially you had an apex anomaly, a massive, unknown bipedal predator, drawn to the exact same remaining water source. The stage was set. The environment had been pushed to its absolute breaking point. The tension in the air was as thick and suffocating as the dust blowing across the barren prairie. It only needed a single spark to ignite the tragedy. That spark would come in the form of a destroyed chicken coop, a set of impossible footprints, and a father's fateful demand that his son prove his manhood in the darkest, most dangerous patch of woods in South Texas. When we think of monsters, we often imagine them lurking in the darkest corners of a vacuum, waiting for the perfect moment to strike when their victims are most vulnerable. In the late 1860s, the entire state of Texas was exactly that, a vacuum. It was a hollowed-out shell of a society, stripped of its defenses, its resources, and its collective sanity. To understand the specific suffocating pressure cooker that existed inside the Vance family cabin on the edge of the Converse scrubland, we have to look at the psychological and socio-political wreckage left in the wake of the American Civil War. This is the era of Reconstruction. But out on the Texas frontier, Reconstruction was a bitter, ironic term. Nothing was being rebuilt. Everything was simply falling apart. Following the collapse of the Confederacy in 1865, Texas entered a period of unprecedented lawlessness. The state government was in shambles, the economy was completely decimated, and the currency was worthless. But the most dangerous aspect of this era for isolated farmers like Elias Vance was the complete absence of organized protection. Let me explain a crucial, often overlooked detail of this time period. Before the war, the Texas frontier was guarded by a network of state militias and the Texas Rangers, who actively patrolled the outer settlements to defend against Comanche and Kiowa raiding parties. But during early Reconstruction, federal authorities dissolved these local ranger companies, viewing them as potential insurgent threats. The federal troops brought in to replace them were stationed in the major cities or far-flung western forts, leaving a massive, unprotected void in central and southern Texas. The pioneer families were entirely on their own. If a band of outlaws decided to take your property, no cavalry was coming to save you. If a prolonged drought began to starve your family, no relief wagons were rolling over the horizon. And if something massive and hungry began stalking your livestock from the darkness of Cibolo Creek, you had absolutely no one to call for help. This was the terrifying reality of Elias Vance. Elias was not a cruel man by nature, but the frontier did not reward kindness, and the war had burned away whatever softness he might have once possessed. Historical records from the era suggest that many of the men who settled the tough scrublands east of San Antonio were veterans who had seen the absolute worst of human depravity. They had survived the meat grinder of the war, only to return to a home front that was equally intent on killing them. Today we have a clinical understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder. We understand the physiological changes that occur in the brain when a human being is subjected to prolonged terror, violence, and the threat of death. But in 1868, there was no therapy. There were no diagnoses. The medical community occasionally referred to the condition as soldier's heart or nostalgia, a gross underestimation of the profound psychological damage these men carried. Elias Vance brought the war home with him. He operated in a state of perpetual hypervigilance. Every snapped twig in the night was a potential threat. Every shadow held a phantom enemy. He was locked in an endless, exhausting cycle of survival mode, pouring his broken body into the unforgiving, parched earth of his homestead, just to keep his family breathing for one more day. And then there was his son, Thomas. Thomas Vance was 15 years old in the summer of 1868. By all accounts passed down through the local lore, Thomas was a stark contrast to his father. He was quiet, introspective, and physically frail. He was a boy who found more comfort in the dog-eared pages of family Bibles and salvaged books than he did in the harsh, blistering sun of the cattle pens. In a different time, in a different place, Thomas might have been a scholar, a clerk, or a teacher. But out on the rugged fringe of Bexar County, an inclination toward books was viewed not as a virtue, but as a fatal vulnerability. The dynamic between Elias and Thomas is the emotional core of this tragedy. It is easy, through a modern lens, to view Elias as a tyrant, but to do so is to fundamentally misunderstand the brutal calculus of 19th century frontier survival. Elias's harshness was not rooted in malice. It was rooted in abject, paralyzing fear. He looked at his gentle, soft-spoken son and saw a boy who was entirely unequipped to survive the world as it actually existed. Elias believed with the absolute conviction of a man who had seen death up close, that a man had to be forged into iron if he wanted to live. Weakness was a luxury that the frontier did not tolerate. If Elias died, a very real possibility from disease, injury, or attack, Thomas would be left to protect the homestead. And as it stood, Thomas would not survive the winter. This desperate need to harden his son came to a boiling point as the drought ravaged their farm. The livestock were dying. The few remaining calves and chickens were being picked off in the night. The family's food supply was dwindling to critical levels. Meat was no longer a staple. It was a desperate necessity. To make matters worse, the architecture of their isolation offered no comfort. Like many early settlers, the Vance family likely lived in a dog trot cabin. This was a common style of frontier architecture, consisting of 2 log cabins connected by an open, covered breezeway. While the dog trot design was excellent for catching the prevailing cross breezes, during the stifling Texas summers, it was a psychological nightmare when you knew you were being hunted. The open breezeway meant there was a gaping hole right through the center of their home. At night, as the wind howled and the unseen predator circled the property line, the darkness would push right up against their very doors. There was no true barrier between the fragile warmth of the family hearth and the lethal wilderness outside. As the attacks on their livestock grew bolder, the tension inside the cabin became unbearable. Elias could hear the desperate howling of coyotes and the low, unnatural rumbling coming from the direction of Skull's Crossing. He watched his son flinch at every sound. He saw the terror in Thomas's eyes. It was an unacceptable flaw that had to be beaten out of the boy by the sheer force of reality. The boy needed a baptism by fire. He needed to step into the darkness and conquer it, or he would be consumed by it. When a hunter tracks an animal through the South Texas scrubland, they aren't just looking for footprints. They are reading a narrative written in the dust. A snapped mesquite branch tells you the animal's height. The depth of the track in the dry clay tells you its weight. The distance between the strides tells you its speed, and more importantly, its state of mind. Was it grazing? Was it fleeing? Or was it hunting? To understand the inciting incident that set the Converse Werewolf legend into motion, we have to examine the crime scene that Elias Vance woke up to on that fateful morning. The tension that had been building inside their dog trot cabin, fueled by the relentless drought of 1868, the looming threat of starvation, and the profound psychological scars of the frontier finally shattered. It started with the silence. On a working homestead, mornings are defined by noise. The braying of mules, the lowing of cattle, and the sharp territorial crowing of roosters. But on this specific morning, the air around the Vance property was completely, unnervingly still. When Elias walked out onto the hard-packed dirt of his yard, he immediately saw why. The family's chicken coop, a sturdy structure built of thick, hand-hewn lumber and heavy wire, had been utterly obliterated. This wasn't the work of a coyote slipping under the fence to steal a quick meal. The door of the coop hadn't been pried open. The thick wooden framing had been shattered inward, displaying a level of blunt force that defied conventional local predators. Inside, it was a scene of absolute carnage. But it was the nature of the carnage that struck a chord of primal fear in Elias. Predators in the wild operate on a strict calorie deficit logic. A cougar or a wolf kills to eat, consuming what it needs and often dragging the rest away to cache for later. They do not waste energy. But what happened in the Vance's coop was a frenzy. It was an act of surplus killing, where the predator slaughters far more than it can possibly consume. This behavior is sometimes seen in wild predators, but usually only when prey is confined and triggers a continuous predatory reflex. However, amidst the blood and feathers in the dust, Elias found something far more disturbing than the dead livestock. He found the narrative in the dirt. He found the tracks. The footprints pressed deep into the dry, unyielding Texas clay surrounding the ruined coop were entirely anomalous. They were massive, far exceeding the dimensions of any known lobo wolf or mountain lion in the Edwards Plateau. But it wasn't just the size that was wrong, it was the anatomy of the stride. To understand why these tracks would confuse and terrify a seasoned frontiersman, we need to briefly delve into the biomechanics of animal locomotion. Most predatory mammals, like dogs and cats, are digitigrade. This means they walk on their toes, with their heels permanently raised off the ground. Humans and bears are plantigrade. We walk with our entire foot, heel to toe, striking the earth. The tracks in Elias's yard displayed a horrifying amalgamation of these traits. The impressions showed thick, heavy toe pads and deep gouging claw marks, indicative of a massive canine. But the tracks were elongated, suggesting that the creature's heel was striking the ground in a plantigrade fashion, distributing an immense, heavy load. Even more chilling, the tracks did not show the typical four-footed gait of a quadruped. Now, an experienced tracker like Elias would logically try to rationalize this. The most common explanation for unusually large, seemingly bipedal tracks in the wild is a phenomenon known as direct registering. This occurs when an animal, typically a bear, places its larger hind foot directly into the footprint left by its smaller front foot as it walks. This creates an overlapping, distorted track that can look surprisingly human or bipedal. Elias likely tried to convince himself that a starving black bear had wandered down from the cedar breaks, but the stride length, the distance between the alternating left and right tracks, was far too wide for a bear. Whatever had shattered his coop had walked away on two legs, carrying a massive amount of weight, heading straight toward the dense, isolated canopy of Skull's Crossing. The loss of the chickens was a catastrophic blow to the family's food supply. The survival margin had just dropped to zero. Elias made his fateful decision. He retrieved his heavy military-issue Enfield musket, but he did not intend to track the beast himself. His crops were failing, his remaining livestock needed immediate securing, and the brutal reality of his worldview dictated that his fragile 15-year-old son Thomas needed to face the harshness of their reality. So, on a suffocatingly hot afternoon, Elias made the fateful decision that would seal their family's tragic place in Texas folklore. He walked into the cabin, pulled his heavy rifle down from the mantel, and shoved it into the trembling hands of his 15-year-old son. The weapon Elias handed over wasn't a lightweight modern hunting rifle. It was almost certainly a military surplus weapon brought back from the war, likely an Enfield pattern 1853 rifled musket. This detail is vital to understanding the sheer terror Thomas would soon face. The Enfield was a heavy 9-pound weapon of war. It fired a massive thumb-sized projectile, capable of devastating damage, but it was a muzzle loader. To fire it, Thomas would have to stand up, bite open a paper cartridge, pour the black powder down the barrel, push the heavy ball in, draw a long metal ramrod to pack it down, replace the ramrod, pull back the heavy hammer, and place a tiny brass percussion cap. Even an experienced soldier took at least 20 seconds to reload this weapon. A terrified, shaking 15-year-old boy might take a minute or more. It was a one-shot weapon. If Thomas encountered something dangerous in the woods, he had exactly one chance to kill it. If he missed, or if the ancient black powder misfired, he would be left holding nothing but a 9-pound club. Elias looked at his pale, terrified son holding the massive weapon. The order he gave was not a request. It was an absolute mandate, delivered with the cold, unyielding authority of a desperate father. Thomas was to walk the 2 miles down to the deep, isolated pools of Skull Crossing. He was to wait in the suffocating heat of the forest. He was to shoot a deer to feed his starving family, and he was absolutely not to return without meat. Elias was sending his boy out to conquer the wilderness, completely unaware that the wilderness at Skull Crossing had already conquered everything else, and it was starving for something new. Historical lore often glosses over this initial excursion, jumping straight to the climax. But to understand the tragedy, we must follow Thomas on his first agonizing trip into the woods. Thomas left the sun-baked open prairie and descended into the forest. The temperature immediately dropped. The thick canopy of bald cypress and sprawling live oaks blocked out the fierce Texas sun, replacing it with a claustrophobic, humid twilight. The smell of the muddy creek bed, infused with the natural sulfur of the region's lignitic shale, filled the air. Thomas was not a hunter. He was carrying a weapon that weighed almost a tenth of his own body weight. As he crept through the dense underbrush of the Midway Group shale, every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot. And then, the feeling of the woods shifted. Anyone who has spent time in deep, isolated wilderness knows the feeling. It is a sudden physiological response. The hairs on your arms stand up. Your peripheral vision narrows. The ancient reptilian part of your brain suddenly registers that you are no longer the observer in this environment. You're being observed. According to the local legend, Thomas didn't just feel it, he saw it. The accounts passed down through Converse history are fragmented, but they all share a terrifying consensus. As Thomas waited in the shadows, he caught movement in the brush. He expected to see the brown flank of a white-tailed deer. Instead, he saw a silhouette that defied natural law. It was towering, heavily muscled, and covered in dark matted hair. It was watching him, and it was standing upright. The boy's nervous system experienced a complete catastrophic override. The fight-or-flight response is a powerful biological mechanism, dumping adrenaline into the bloodstream. For Thomas, clutching a single-shot rifle he barely knew how to load, fight was not an option. He bolted. He abandoned the hunt, crashing blindly through the thorn-heavy scrub brush, running on pure, unadulterated terror until his lungs burned, and he burst back out onto the open prairie of his father's homestead. He arrived back at the cabin pale, trembling, and completely empty-handed. The confrontation that followed between father and son is the tragic crux of the Converse legend. Thomas, hyperventilating and shaking, tried to explain what he had seen. He told his father about the monster. He used the only vocabulary a 19th century boy had for a bipedal wolf-like anomaly. He called it a werewolf. Imagine Elias's position. He is a man grounded entirely in the dirt, the sweat, and the blood of physical survival. He has survived a horrific war. He is currently watching his farm die of thirst. He has just lost a critical food source to a violent predator. To Elias, the world is a series of tangible, brutal facts. Monsters from European folklore do not exist. What does exist in Elias's hardened mind is cowardice. Elias looked at his son and saw exactly what he had always feared: a boy who lacked the iron necessary to survive the frontier. He didn't hear a genuine warning about an apex anomaly. He heard the frantic, imaginative excuses of a boy who was too terrified of the woods to complete a simple, life-saving chore. He believed Thomas had likely heard a wild hog or a stray cougar, panicked, and fabricated a ghost story to avoid going back into the shadows. It was a failure he could not accept. In a surge of frustration and desperate authority, Elias refused to listen. He shoved the heavy musket back into his son's chest. He pointed a calloused finger back toward the dark looming tree line of Cibolo Creek. He ordered Thomas to turn around. He ordered him to walk back into the woods, and he explicitly commanded him not to return until he had meat for the table. As Thomas turned and slowly walked back toward Skull's Crossing, the Texas sun began to dip violently toward the horizon. The long shadows of the prairie stretched out, entirely swallowing the boy's retreating figure. He was walking back into the exact same brush where the giant, overlapping tracks had originated. There is a distinct, measurable phenomenon that occurs when you transition from an open, sunlit prairie into the dense, sunken canopy of a Texas zone. The temperature can plummet by as much as 10 degrees within a few dozen yards. The ambient noise of the plains, the wind tearing through the mesquite, the distant calls of prairie dogs, is suddenly swallowed by the thick vegetation. The air becomes heavy, saturated, and perfectly still. It feels, in a very literal sense, like stepping out of the realm of the living and descending into a subterranean world. This was the physical reality that 15-year-old Thomas Vance faced as he walked away from his father's cabin and headed back toward the dark waters of Skull's Crossing. The sun was beginning its violent descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the scrubland. With every step Thomas took, the light grew weaker, and the oppressive, suffocating reality of the woods grew stronger. To understand the sheer magnitude of the terror Thomas was experiencing, we have to deconstruct the sensory environment of Cibolo Creek in 1868. We have to look at what his eyes were seeing, what his hands were feeling, and most importantly, what his brain was desperately trying to process through the paralyzing fog of fear. Let's start with the physical burden. Thomas was clutching a 9-pound military-issue Enfield musket. His hands, slick with cold sweat, gripped the dark walnut stock. Every time he shifted the weapon, the metal sling swivels clinked together, a tiny metallic sound that seemed deafening in the unnatural quiet of the woods. He knew he only had one shot. He knew that loading a second round in the dark, with shaking hands, was a physical impossibility. The weapon wasn't a comfort. It was a heavy iron anchor tying him to a lethal mandate. As he reached the edge of the embankment and began to slide down into the creek bed, the geology of the region began to actively work against him. The banks of Cibolo Creek at Skull's Crossing are dominated by steep, treacherous inclines composed of blue calcareous clay. During the brutal drought of 1868, the upper layers of this clay would have baked into a hard, cracked crust, but down near the surviving pools of stagnant water, the clay remained deep, slick, and unforgiving. Thomas was no longer walking. He was fighting to maintain his balance, his boots sinking into the dark mud, leaving a trail that any predator could easily follow. But it wasn't the mud that triggered the deepest, most primal alarm bells in Thomas's mind. It was the smell. In almost every historical account of a cryptid encounter, from the Beast of Bray Road to the various dogman legends across North America, witnesses report a sudden, overwhelming stench. It is frequently described as the smell of rotting meat mixed with sulfur or brimstone. In the superstitious minds of early pioneers, this scent was the undisputed olfactory signature of a demon. It was proof that hell had opened its jaws. But here at Crossroads of the Vale, we do not simply accept folklore at face value. We look for the empirical foundation of the nightmare. And at Skull's Crossing, that foundation is written entirely in the bedrock. Beneath the blue clay and the cross-bedded sandstone of the region lies a specific geological stratum known as lignitic shale. This is a dark, carbon-rich rock formation that contains high concentrations of iron sulfides, particularly a mineral called pyrite, commonly known as fool's gold. When this shale is exposed to the elements, to the dampness of the creek bed and the suffocating heat of the Texas summer, a chemical reaction occurs. The iron sulfides oxidize and break down, releasing hydrogen sulfide gas. Hydrogen sulfide is a colorless gas with the distinct, overpowering odor of rotten eggs. It is heavier than air, meaning it doesn't dissipate into the wind. Instead, it sinks. It pools in the lowest topographical depressions, places exactly like the deep ravines of Skull's Crossing. As Thomas descended further into the creek bed, he was walking directly into a natural pocket of hydrogen sulfide. The smell of sulfur, the literal smell of biblical brimstone, filled his lungs. His brain, already pushed to the absolute breaking point by his earlier encounter with the massive bipedal silhouette, immediately connected this chemical reality to his deepest religious fears. The earth itself smelled like a demon. This is how the environment actively weaponizes a human being's psychology. The geology of Bexar County wasn't just setting the stage. It was actively constructing the mythology in real time within the mind of a terrified boy. Thomas pushed through a thick barrier of dwarf palmettos, their sharp fan-like leaves scraping against the heavy cotton of his trousers. The canopy of ancient bald cypress trees overhead completely interlocked, extinguishing the last remaining rays of the setting sun. The creek bed was now bathed in a bruised purple twilight. He was approaching the largest remaining pool of water, the epicenter of the tracks he and his father had found earlier that morning. Thomas stopped. The oppressive silence of the woods was suddenly broken by a sound. It wasn't the sharp, explosive crack of a predator breaking a branch. It was a wet, heavy, rhythmic sound. It was the sound of something large, breathing in the damp mud. He raised the heavy infield musket, resting the iron barrel against the trunk of a massive oak tree to steady his violently shaking arms. He pulled back the heavy hammer. The sharp double click of the lock mechanism echoed through the hollow, but the breathing didn't stop. Slowly, agonizingly, Thomas edged around the trunk of the oak, his eyes straining to pierce the gloom. He expected to see the towering wolf-like monstrosity that had chased him hours before. He expected to see glowing, baleful eyes reflecting the meager ambient light. He expected to look into the face of a werewolf. But what he saw curled up in the mud at the water's edge was not a monster. It was a man. To understand the shock of this discovery, finding another human being deep in the isolated woods of the Texas frontier was often far more dangerous than encountering a wild animal. The scrublands were a haven for the desperate, the displaced, and the violent. There were Confederate deserters who refused to surrender, hiding out from federal authorities. There were ruined farmers who had lost everything to the war and the subsequent economic collapse, reduced to violent vagrancy. There were outlaw gangs taking advantage of the complete lack of law enforcement to prey on isolated homesteads. Thomas stared down the barrel of his rifle at the shape in the mud. The figure was lying on its side, facing away from the boy, half submerged in the shallow, stagnant water. The man was colossal in stature, his frame speaking to a life of immense physical labor or immense violence. He was dressed in the rotting, threadbare remnants of what might have once been a military uniform, though whether it was the gray of the Confederacy or the blue of the Union was impossible to tell beneath the layers of thick, caked mud and filth. But it was what surrounded the man that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. The mud bank around the sleeping vagrant was littered with the fresh, brutalized remains of his father's livestock. The white and brown feathers of the Vance family chickens were scattered like gruesome confetti across the dark clay, plastered to the earth by pools of dark, congealing blood. Bones had been snapped and discarded with casual, overwhelming force. Thomas's mind raced, desperately trying to reconcile the conflicting data. His father's words echoed in his head. "You saw a wild hog, boy. You panicked. Had it been a man all along? Had a starving, massive drifter raided their coop, destroyed the heavy wooden framing with sheer desperate strength, and then retreated to this dark, sulfur-scented watering hole to gorge himself on raw meat? It made a terrifying, rational sense. A massive man running through the brush, wearing heavy boots that distorted in the soft mud, could easily account for the bipedal tracks. It could account for the destruction. Relief, cold and sharp, washed over Thomas. It wasn't a demon. It wasn't a werewolf. It was just a desperate, dangerous thief. A man of flesh and blood. A man who could be killed by the heavy ball resting in the chamber of his musket. Thomas lowered the rifle slightly, his finger resting nervously outside the trigger guard. He took a single, hesitant step forward, his boot making a soft sucking sound in the wet clay. The sound was microscopic, but in the absolute stillness of the hollow, it was a thunderclap. The massive figure in the mud stopped breathing. The sudden cessation of sound was more terrifying than a roar. The vagrant lay perfectly, unnaturally still. And then, slowly, with an agonizing, deliberate grace that defied his massive bulk, the man began to rise. He didn't scramble to his feet like a startled animal or a sleeping drifter caught off guard. He pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, his back arched, his massive shoulders rolling beneath the ruined fabric of his shirt. As the man shifted, the purple twilight caught the side of his face. Thomas froze. The rationalization that had just calmed his racing heart shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The man's jaw was elongated, thrust forward at an impossible, grotesque angle. His skin was stretched tight over bone structure that did not belong to the human race. And as the vagrant turned his head slowly toward the boy, Thomas saw the eyes. They were not the whites of a terrified thief. They were large, luminous, and reflected the ambient light with the cold, predatory glare of an apex killer. The stench of sulfur suddenly seemed to double in intensity, burning the inside of Thomas's nose. The man on the ground inhaled deeply, a long, ragged, wet sound that rattled deep in a massive chest. He was smelling the boy. Thomas didn't pull the trigger. He didn't even attempt to raise the rifle. The sheer, overwhelming biological terror, the absolute certainty that he was standing in the presence of an apex anomaly, paralyzed his motor functions. He dropped the 9-pound infield musket into the mud. He turned, scrambling up the slick blue clay of the embankment on his hands and knees, tearing his fingernails on the roots of the palmettos. He clawed his way out of the subterranean darkness of Skull's Crossing, emerging back into the fading twilight of the prairie. He ran back toward his father's cabin, leaving the only weapon he had in the mud. He was bringing the exact news his father refused to hear, but this time he wasn't going back alone. The true nightmare of the Converse Werewolf was no longer an isolated encounter. It was about to become a war. When Thomas Vance burst through the door of his family's dog trot cabin, he brought the nightmare of the woods directly into the fragile sanctuary of his home. He was hyperventilating, his clothes were torn by the sharp palmetto leaves, and his boots and hands were caked in the slick blue calcareous clay of Cibolo Creek. But worst of all, his hands were empty. He had abandoned his father's heavy infield musket in the mud. To understand the volatile chain reaction that occurred next, we have to look closely at the psychology of Elias Vance. Thomas babbled incoherently about a giant. He spoke of a massive vagrant sleeping in the mud, surrounded by the bloody feathers of their stolen chickens. He tried to explain the impossible, distorted face and the glowing, predatory eyes. Elias did not hear a ghost story. He did not hear a warning about an apex anomaly. His brain, hardwired for the brutal, empirical reality of frontier survival, filtered his son's panicked words through a lens of pure, cold pragmatism. Elias heard that a massive, violent drifter was currently camped on his property. He heard that this drifter had destroyed his chicken coop, slaughtered his vital food supply, and terrified his son into abandoning a highly valuable firearm. In the modern world, property theft is a crime. In the drought-stricken, starving isolation of Bexar County in 1868, the theft of a pioneer's food supply was not merely a crime. It was an existential threat. It was a death sentence. And in the absence of a structured law enforcement presence, that threat required an immediate, terminal response. This brings us to a fundamental institution of 19th century American life, the pioneer posse. During the chaos of the Reconstruction era, formal law enforcement in the rural Texas scrubland was practically non-existent. There was no local sheriff to summon, no deputies to dispatch. Instead, the communities relied on a system of localized frontier justice. When a severe threat emerged, be it a raiding party, a band of cattle rustlers, or a violent vagrant, the men of the surrounding homesteads would rapidly mobilize. These were sometimes referred to as committees of vigilance. These posses were not chaotic mobs. They were organized, heavily armed groups of men who operated under a shared, unspoken social contract. You protected your neighbor's property because tomorrow you might need them to protect yours. Elias Vance did not hesitate. His earlier frustration with his son instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, martial fury. He saddled his remaining horse in the pitch blackness of the yard and he rode out into the night to rally his neighbors. The gathering of the posse happened quickly. Within an hour, several riders converged on the Vance homestead. To understand the sheer amount of firepower and hardened experience that was about to descend upon Skull's Crossing, we must look at the men who answered Elias's call. These were not soft suburban men. They were hardened agriculturalists, seasoned hunters, and in many cases combat veterans who had survived the harrowing battlefields of the Civil War. They were men accustomed to violence, completely desensitized to blood, and highly proficient in the art of killing. They also brought an arsenal of devastating mid-19th century weaponry. The men checked their percussion caps. They slid heavy balls into their cylinders. They were a formidable, lethal force. In any conventional scenario, a single vagrant cornered in a creek bed by half a dozen heavily armed veterans would be dead in a matter of seconds. The posse possessed overwhelming firepower, but they were operating under a massive tactical disadvantage, one dictated entirely by the environment. It was a moonless night, and they were heading into a densely wooded zone. They had to rely on artificial illumination. In 1868, portable illumination meant kerosene storm lanterns. A kerosene lantern operates by drawing fuel up a cotton wick into a glass globe, creating a steady, contained flame. To the human eye, a lantern seems like a source of safety. But strategically, in a combat or hunting scenario, it is a catastrophic liability. Here is the physics of why. A kerosene lantern casts a usable sphere of light, approximately 10 to 15 feet in diameter. However, the brightness of the flame forces the human pupil to constrict. This means that while the posse could see perfectly within that tiny 15-foot sphere, the darkness beyond the light was rendered absolutely, impenetrably black. Furthermore, the dense underbrush, the twisting trunks of the bald cypress trees, and the low-hanging Spanish moss would catch the lantern light, casting massive, distorted, dancing shadows. Every shifting shadow looked like a crouching man. Every sway of a branch looked like a lunging attacker. The lanterns did not conquer the darkness of Skull's Crossing. They merely highlighted the posse's vulnerability, painting them as glowing targets moving through a blind void. As the group rode away from the Vance homestead and descended toward the lowlands of Cibolo Creek, the air began to change. The dry, dusty wind of the open prairie died away, replaced by the heavy, suffocating humidity of the river basin. And then the smell hit them. The harsh, stinging odor of hydrogen sulfide rose up from the creek bed. The men likely tied their handkerchiefs over their faces, cursing the foul air, but the horses reacted with a far deeper, more primal understanding. Equine olfactory senses are incredibly acute. A horse can smell a predator, like a mountain lion or a bear, from hundreds of yards away long before a human can see it. As the posse reached the edge of the dense tree line where the prairie dropped off into the hollow of Skull's Crossing, the horses began to balk. They tossed their heads, biting the iron bits in their mouths. They pinned their ears back and refused to step forward into the darkness. They were picking up a scent that terrified them, a scent that carried the pheromonal signature of a massive apex predator. But the men ignored the warnings of their animals. Driven by a volatile mix of righteous fury, economic desperation, and the arrogant assumption that they were the most dangerous things in the night, they forced their horses forward. When the horses absolutely refused to enter the dense brush, the men dismounted. They tied the trembling animals to the mesquite trees on the perimeter. They unholstered their heavy Colt revolvers. They pulled the hammers back on their double-barreled shotguns, the sharp metallic clicks echoing ominously in the still sulfur-choked air. Elias Vance pushed forward, holding his kerosene lantern high. They stepped out of the starlight and descended into the black, suffocating canopy of the forest. They were walking down the slick, blue clay embankment, following the deep, distorted footprints right back to the stagnant pool of water. They believed they were a posse hunting a man. They were completely unaware that they were walking directly into the jaws of a biological impossibility. When you place a human being in an environment of total sensory deprivation, and then introduce a singular blinding light source, you completely destroy their ability to perceive depth and context. This is the physiological reality the posse faced as they descended into the suffocating, sulfur-choked basin of Skull's Crossing. Elias Vance, flanked by half a dozen heavily armed combat veterans, moved through the thick blue clay of the creek bed. They were carrying double-barreled percussion shotguns and heavy Colt revolvers, weapons capable of tearing a man to pieces in seconds. but their reliance on the kerosene lantern effectively blinded them to anything outside a 15-foot radius. The darkness beyond that sphere was absolute. As they pushed through the final barrier of sharp dwarf palmettos, the weak yellow light of the lantern washed over the stagnant pool of water. The first thing the light revealed was the violence. The mud bank was heavily stained with dark, congealing blood. The pristine white and brown feathers of the Vance family's stolen chickens were plastered against the wet earth, surrounding shattered, heavy bones that had been snapped with devastating casual force. The second thing they saw was the heavy 9-pound Enfield musket lying abandoned in the mud, the unmistakable proof of Thomas's desperate plight. And then, the lantern light hit the shape curled at the water's edge. It was exactly as Thomas had described, a massive, hulking figure of a man, dressed in the rotting, mud-caked remnants of a military uniform lying on his side. The men instinctively fanned out. They formed a tactical semicircle, raising their shotguns and resting their thumbs heavily on the hammers. They had the high ground, they had the numbers, they had overwhelming firepower. Elias Vance stepped forward. He held the lantern high with his left hand and aimed his heavy revolver with his right. He commanded the vagrant to stand up, his voice echoing off the dense canopy of cypress trees, hard and devoid of any mercy. The figure in the mud did not scramble, it did not beg. Slowly the massive shoulders rolled. The man pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, the wet clay making a sickening sucking sound against his palms. And as he turned his head to look over his shoulder at the assembled posse, Elias's lantern light caught the creature's eyes. This is the exact moment the Converse legend shifts from a tale of frontier justice into a documented biological nightmare. The eyes that looked back at the posse did not reflect the light like human eyes. They glowed. They burned with a bright, internal incandescence that cut straight through the gloom. To understand why this paralyzed a group of hardened veterans, we have to look at the anatomy of the eye. Humans do not possess the biological hardware necessary for eyeshine. However, nocturnal apex predators, like wolves, cougars, and alligators, possess a specialized reflective layer of tissue situated immediately behind the retina. Its evolutionary purpose is to reflect visible light back through the retina a second time, drastically increasing the light available to the photoreceptors and allowing the animal to see in near total darkness. When artificial light, like a lantern or a modern headlight, hits a creature, the light bounces back, creating the terrifying glowing eyeshine effect. The vagrant looking at Elias had eyes that glowed with a baleful, unnatural luminance. He possessed the ocular anatomy of a nocturnal killer. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. None of the men fired. In military and law enforcement training, there is a concept known as the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. It is the cognitive process of reacting to an opponent. These veterans were highly trained in this cycle. But as they looked at the glowing eyes and the elongated, impossible jawline of the man in the mud, their cognitive processing catastrophically stalled. They were trapped in the orient phase. Their brains, grounded entirely in the harsh, pragmatic reality of the 19th century frontier, simply refused to accept the data their optical nerves were transmitting. A man's eyes do not glow. A man's jaw does not jut forward like the snout of a rabid wolf. Because they could not comprehend what they were seeing, they could not decide to act, and in that paralyzing window of cognitive dissonance, the transformation began. The accounts passed down through folklore do not describe a magical cinematic shift. They describe an agonizing, bone-cracking biological upheaval. It was an aggressive, violent anatomical mutation happening in real time, accompanied by a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their abbreviated lives. It started as a low, wet percussive sound, like thick branches snapping under immense pressure. The sound was emanating directly from inside the vagrant's body. The posse watched in frozen horror as the creature's spine seemed to violently uncoil, the vertebrae popping with sickening, audible cracks. The rotting fabric of the military uniform tore to shreds as the muscle mass beneath it expanded at an impossible, exponential rate. The creature threw its head back, emitting a sound that was half human scream, half guttural roar. As it did, the jaw visibly dislocated and pushed forward, the facial bones reshaping underneath the skin. Thick, dark, shaggy hair began to aggressively push through the pores, covering the previously pale, mud-caked flesh. But the most terrifying shift occurred in the creature's legs. The human knee is designed for plantigrade walking. As the beast rose from the mud, its lower anatomy violently fractured and restructured. The heel pushed upward, the bones lengthening, shifting the creature into a digitigrade stance, the specialized spring-loaded hind legs of a canine predator, designed to support massive weight and generate explosive speed. The transformation was rapid, violent, and completely shattered any remaining illusion that the posse was hunting a human being. When the percussive snapping of bones finally ceased, the creature stood at its full height. The lantern light barely reached his chest. It was an unholy amalgamation of apex predators. It possessed the sheer muscular bulk and upper body strength of a silverback gorilla, but the elongated snout, the tufted ears, and the digitigrade, backward-bending legs of a monstrous wolf. It stood between 8 and 9 feet tall on its hind legs, completely dwarfing the hardened veterans who surrounded it. The air grew icy cold. The overwhelming stench of rotting meat and hydrogen sulfide from the lignitic shale basin became almost unbearable, burning the men's eyes and throats. The beast looked down at the circle of men. It did not look frightened by the heavy shotguns leveled at its chest. It looked at them the same way a starving wolf looks at a flock of trapped sheep. It recognized that they were no longer the hunters. The creature inhaled a massive, wet breath, its broad chest expanding, and let out a roar that physically vibrated in the chests of the men. It was a sound so loud, so completely alien to the Texas scrubland that it finally snapped the posse out of their cognitive paralysis. The spell of disbelief was broken. Pure, unadulterated survival instinct took over. Elias Vance, standing closest to the towering anomaly, screamed a command that was drowned out by the monster's roar. He squeezed the trigger of his heavy Colt 44 revolver. The flash of the black powder illuminated the entire hollow for a fraction of a second, revealing the horrifying muscular detail of the beast, freezing the nightmare in stark, blinding white relief. When violence erupts on the frontier, it is not orchestrated. It is chaotic, blinding, and deafening. In the suffocating, sulfur-filled basin of Skull's Crossing, Elias Vance fired his heavy .44 caliber revolver point-blank into the chest of a biological impossibility. The flash of the black powder was blinding. It was the catalyst that snapped the pioneer posse out of their paralyzing disbelief. A fraction of a second later, half a dozen double-barreled percussion shotguns and lever-action rifles roared into the darkness. To understand the sheer magnitude of kinetic energy unleashed in that hollow, we have to look at the ballistics of 19th century weaponry. A .44 caliber ball fired from a Colt Army revolver travels at approximately 850 feet per second. A blast of double-aught buckshot from a 10-gauge percussion shotgun unleashes over a dozen massive pellets simultaneously. At a range of less than 20 feet, this concentrated volley should have biologically disassembled anything standing in its path. It should have shattered bone, liquefied organs, and dropped the creature instantly into the mud. But it didn't. The accounts of what happened next are fractured, passed down through generations of Bexar County locals. But they all share one terrifying, consistent detail: the impossible physics of the creature's escape. When you fire half a dozen black powder weapons in a damp, low-lying creek bed with zero wind, the immediate result is a dense, impenetrable cloud of caustic white smoke. The kerosene lantern Elias held was instantly obscured. The men were plunged back into total darkness, choking on the acrid smell of burnt sulfur and saltpeter. They expected to hear the massive thud of an 8-foot beast hitting the wet clay. Instead, they heard a terrifying, explosive rustle of vegetation overhead. We talked in the last episode about the creature's biomechanical shift, the violent restructuring of its legs into a digitigrade stance. This canine leg structure acts as a massive biological coil. As the gunfire erupted, the creature didn't charge the men. It compressed those massive hind legs and launched itself upward and outward with a speed that defied its immense bulk. It bounded out of the immediate kill zone, absorbing or entirely evading the lethal volley of bullets, and vanished into the impenetrable blackness of the canopy. The posse scrambled in the smoke. Men were shouting, their ears ringing painfully from the concussive blasts. They were desperately trying to reload their weapons in the dark, a clumsy, terrifying process of pouring powder and ramming bullets while waiting for an apex predator to drop on them from the shadows. But the attack from the trees never came. Instead, the ringing silence of the creek bed was shattered by a sound far worse than the roar of the monster. It was a sound that would fracture Elias Vance's sanity and cement this legend into the bloody soil of Texas folklore forever. It was the terrified, agonizing scream of a 15-year-old boy. It came from the tree line just a few dozen yards behind the posse. The men froze. Elias's blood ran cold. He had left his son safely behind the thick hand-hewn logs. Why was Thomas's voice echoing through the darkness of Skull's Crossing? To answer this, we must look at the psychological crucible of the pioneer family. We discussed earlier the immense coercive enforcement of frontier expectations placed upon Thomas. He was a bookish, fragile boy who had failed his father's ultimate test. He had run from the woods, and worse, he had abandoned his father's prized military-issue Enfield musket in the mud. In the rigid, unforgiving hierarchy of a 19th century agrarian family, that shame was an unbearable weight. While Elias rode out to gather the heavily armed posse, Thomas was left alone with his perceived cowardice. Driven by a desperate, fatal need to prove his courage and retrieve the lost weapon, the boy had slipped out of the barricaded cabin. He had followed the posse's lantern light from a distance, creeping back into the very woods that had terrified him hours before. He arrived at the perimeter of the hollow just as the men confronted the vagrant, and when the gunfire erupted, the terrified beast bounded away from the flash and the noise, directly into the path of the approaching boy. Elias dropped his lantern. It shattered against a cypress root, the kerosene instantly igniting in a pool of bright localized fire. The men abandoned their reloading and charged blindly up the muddy embankment toward the source of the scream, their heavy boots tearing through the sharp palmettos. They pushed through the dense thicket of Spanish moss and ancient oaks, and they stumbled upon an absolute nightmare. The folklore is explicit about this exact moment. The men broke through the brush, holding up a secondary lantern. The weak yellow light cut through the gloom, revealing the massive, hairy beast. It was crouched over the lifeless body of Thomas Vance, the boy who had only wanted to read, the boy who had been forced into the woods to become a man. He lay broken in the Texas dirt, a victim of an anomaly he had desperately tried to warn his father about. The beast looked up at the approaching men. Its snarling snout was pulled back, exposing jagged, lethal teeth. Its eyes burned with that baleful, glowing incandescence. It did not roar this time. It simply looked at Elias, a gaze of cold, predatory intelligence, before it wheeled around and bounded away into the thick woods at lightning speed, swallowed instantly by the blackness of the scrubland. The men raised their empty weapons, but it was over. The monster was gone. The aftermath of a cryptid encounter is rarely discussed in the context of long-term psychological damage. We focus on the monster, the tracks, and the immediate terror. But the true horror of the Converse Werewolf legend is what happened to Elias Vance in the days and weeks that followed. Elias carried the broken body of his son out of the creek bed, out of the sulfur-scented darkness, and back into the unforgiving light of the prairie. But the Elias Vance who walked out of Skull's Crossing was not the same hardened, pragmatic frontiersman who had walked into it. His reality had been systematically dismantled. Psychologists define survivor's guilt as a condition that occurs when a person believes they have done something wrong by surviving a traumatic event when others did not. But Elias's guilt was far more profound, far more toxic. He hadn't just survived. He had actively engineered the circumstances of his son's death. He had refused to believe the boy's warning. He had dismissed a genuine encounter with an apex anomaly as mere cowardice. He had shoved a heavy rifle into a shaking boy's chest and ordered him into the jaws of a predator. Elias Vance was consumed by a grief so absolute, so heavy that it crushed his mind. Elias could not live with the guilt, nor could he live in the house where his son's empty bed served as a constant, agonizing reminder of his failure. The frontier, already suffering under the brutal drought of 1868, had taken everything from him. The earth was dead. The livestock were gone. His bloodline was severed. Late one night, under the pale light of a full Texas moon, Elias Vance walked into his barn and retrieved a heavy jug of kerosene. He did not call for his neighbors. He did not seek salvation. He poured the fuel all over the hand-hewn logs of his cabin. He saturated the open breezeway where he and his son used to sit. He emptied the kerosene over the threshold he had forced Thomas to cross. Then Elias struck a match and let it drop to the floor. He walked inside and closed the heavy wooden doors. By the time the neighboring ranchers saw the glow on the horizon and rode their horses to the Vance property, the cabin was a roaring inferno. The dry, aged wood, practically mummified by the drought, burned with a furious, unstoppable heat. There was no screaming from inside. There was only the roar of the flames and the howling of the wind across the desolate prairie. When the sun rose the next morning, the Vance homestead was nothing but a smoking scar of black ash on the Texas dirt. The Converse Werewolf, or the Dogman of Cibolo Creek, as some modern researchers call it, was never hunted down. No posse ever found its den. It vanished back into the vast, untamed geography of the area, leaving behind only anomalous tracks in the mud, destroyed families, and a ghost story that would be whispered through the region for over a century. When a pioneer cabin burns to the ground, the ashes eventually blow away. The charred earth is reclaimed by the prairie grass. The grass is paved over by concrete, and the concrete becomes the foundation for a modern city. Today, if you stand near the geographic coordinates of Skulls Crossing, you aren't surrounded by unbroken, hostile wilderness. You are surrounded by the suburban sprawl of Bexar County. The year 1868 is a ghost. The Vance family is a dark, localized memory, but a legend, if it is anchored to something physical, something that actually breathes in the dark, does not die simply because we string up streetlights. It adapts. It retreats into the shrinking shadows, waiting for the modern world to stumble blindly back into its territory. To conclude our investigation into the creature of Cibolo Creek, we have to strip away the 19th century superstition and look at the Converse legend through the modern forensic lens of cryptozoology. We have to address the phenomenon known today as the Texas Dogman Triangle. And we have to ask a deeply unsettling question. Did the monster ever actually leave? In 1868, Thomas Vance used the only word his 19th century vocabulary possessed to describe a bipedal wolf-like anomaly, a werewolf. For over a century, that is how the Converse legend was categorized. It was lumped in with European folklore, a supernatural tale of a cursed human being shifting forms under the light of a full moon. But modern cryptid researchers and field investigators have fundamentally reclassified the Converse incident. When we analyze the physical descriptions provided by the historical pioneer posses, the 8 to 9 foot height, the muscular primate-like upper body, the digitigrade hind legs, and the glowing baleful eyes, we are not looking at a mythological werewolf. We are looking at a classic, localized manifestation of a dogman. To understand the terrifying reality of modern sightings, we must draw a strict line between the supernatural and the biological. The mythological werewolf, a human afflicted by a curse or a virus, experiencing a temporary magical metamorphosis. This defies the laws of conservation of mass and biological reality. The cryptozoological dogman, flesh and blood, naturally occurring, undiscovered apex predator. It does not transform into a human. It is a static, biological anomaly that possesses a terrifying amalgamation of canine and primate characteristics, specifically the ability to seamlessly transition from quadrupedal running to bipedal walking. When we view the Converse legend as a dogman encounter, it suddenly stops being an isolated ghost story. It becomes a single data point in a massive, terrifying pattern of sightings stretching across the North American continent, and specifically concentrated heavily in the Lone Star State. In recent years, documentary filmmakers, journalists, and independent researchers have compiled decades of modern sighting reports. When you plot these encounters on a map of Texas, a chilling geographic concentration emerges. This area is unofficially referred to as the Texas Dogman Triangle. While the exact borders fluctuate depending on the researcher, the triangle generally encompasses the dense piney woods of East Texas, stretches westward toward the hill country, and points directly down into the southern scrublands, with Bexar County and the San Antonio metropolitan area sitting directly on the fault line. But how does a massive, 9-foot-tall apex predator survive in the modern era of interstate highways and urban expansion? The answer lies in the concept of the Greenbelt Corridor. While San Antonio has exploded into a massive metropolitan hub, it is fractured by a vast network of creeks, rivers, and undeveloped floodplains. The San Antonio River and the Medina River act as natural, densely wooded highways that cut directly through the concrete jungle. These corridors are teeming with modern prey, an overpopulation of urban white-tailed deer, feral hogs, and stray pets. A highly intelligent, stealth-oriented predator would not need to live in the deep wilderness to survive today. It could thrive right in the shadow of the city, utilizing these green belts to hunt, migrate, and remain entirely unseen by the oblivious, screen-obsessed human population just a few hundred yards away. This brings us to the terrifying reality of the 21st century. The sightings did not stop in 1868. They simply changed context. Instead of a pioneer boy hunting in the deep woods, modern encounters typically involve solitary individuals in transit. They are the long-haul truckers driving down isolated stretches of interstate at 3 in the morning. They are the suburban commuters taking a shortcut through a wooded, unlit county road. They are the late-night joggers utilizing the city's paved park trails. When we aggregate the data from modern reports within the Texas Dogman Triangle, distinct, horrifying behavioral patterns emerge that perfectly echo the Converse legend. Roadkill interaction. A significant number of modern sightings involve motorists spotting what they initially believe is a massive feral dog scavenging a deer carcass on the shoulder of the road. The bipedal shock. The defining moment of the modern encounter occurs when the vehicle approaches. The creature does not scurry away on all fours. It stops, stands up on its digitigrade hind legs, towering over the roof of the car, and casually walks back into the tree line. The Anubis morphology. Witnesses frequently describe the creature's head not as a standard boxy canine skull, but resembling the Egyptian god Anubis. It features a long, pointed snout, tall, tufted ears, and a thick, muscular, unnaturally elongated neck. Furthermore, modern physical evidence occasionally surfaces to support these terrifying eyewitness accounts. In state parks and along isolated shorelines near the Triangle, researchers have documented and cast anomalous footprints. These tracks mirror the exact nightmare Elias Vance found outside his destroyed chicken coop over a century ago. They are massive, often measuring over half a foot in length, pressed deep into the mud to suggest immense weight. They possess the distinct toe pads and claw marks of a canine, but the stride length and the impact distribution clearly indicate a creature walking upright on 2 legs. When a human being sees this, a creature that blurs the evolutionary line between man and beast, it triggers a profound psychological reaction known as the uncanny valley. Our brains are hardwired by millions of years of evolution to recognize predators and to recognize other humans. The dogman represents a catastrophic glitch in that biological software. It is a predator that walks like a man. It is a biological impossibility that forces the human mind into the exact same state of paralyzing cognitive dissonance experienced by the pioneer posse at Skull's Crossing. Why do we remain so captivated by the Converse Werewolf? Why does the Texas Dogman Triangle command such intense, fearful respect in the modern cryptozoological community? Because deep down, beneath the safety of our illuminated cities and our modern technology, we are still the exact same fragile biological creatures that we were in 1868. We have eradicated the Lobo wolf. We have pushed the black bear and mountain lion to the fringes. We have convinced ourselves that we have conquered the food chain and that the night holds absolutely no mysteries we cannot explain. But the legend of the werewolf endures as a vital, terrifying counter-narrative. It is a reminder that the environment does not belong to us. We merely occupy it. When you drive past a thick patch of South Texas scrubland at night, and your headlights catch the sudden, glowing, baleful reflection of eyeshine in the brush, your heart rate will spike. The hairs on your arms will stand up. That is not superstition. That is an ancient, dormant survival instinct screaming at you from the darkest corners of your DNA. It is the primitive realization that no matter how much concrete we pour, there are still apex anomalies living among the shadow predators. The veil between the known world and the impossible is paper thin, and at places like Skull's Crossing, that veil can be torn right open. As we step back from the crossroads, remember the story doesn't end here, because this is just the beginning, searching for the knowledge and wisdom to unravel the mysteries of our universe. Unexplained sightings, spirits, and science. They are all connected in the grand tapestry of life. So remember, keep pulling at the threads, because this has been Crossroads of the Veil.